Hank's weathered hands trembled as he knelt before the two starving foals abandoned on his property line, their pleading eyes and emaciated frames telling a story of corporate cruelty that would soon ignite a war between one determined rancher and a ruthless agricultural empire. The discovery of these discarded assets would not only change his solitary life forever, but expose a systemic callousness that broke the hearts of an entire community fighting to preserve their way of life. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the scrubland as Hank Dawson guided his trusted gelding, Buck, along the boundary fence of the Triple D Ranch. The light painted the distant mountains in hues of purple and gold, a sight that never failed to remind Hank why he'd chosen this life despite its hardships. At 58, his face weathered by decades under the unforgiving sun, Hank had seen just about everything the rugged Montana landscape could throw at a man. The spring had been unusually dry, forcing him to ride farther each day to check on water sources for his small herd. Today's route took him along the edge of his property where it bordered public land, a remote stretch he didn't visit often. Buck's ears suddenly pricked forward, his steady pace faltering. "What is it, boy?" Hank murmured, instantly alert. 25 years working this land had taught him to trust his horse's instincts. He scanned the horizon, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the worn handle of the revolver at his hip. That's when he heard it. A soft, desperate whinnying carried on the morning breeze. Buck snorted, turning his head toward a shallow ravine about 50 yards to their right. Hank gently nudged his mount in that direction, approaching cautiously. As they crested the slight rise, he saw them. Two Palomino foals, their golden coats dulled with dust, standing close together beside the barbed wire fence that marked his property line. They couldn't have been more than a few months old, all spindly legs and uncertainty. "Well, I'll be damned," Hank breathed, dismounting slowly so as not to startle them. He tied Buck to a scrub oak and approached on foot, noting how the foals watched him with equal parts fear and desperate hope. As he drew closer, his heart sank. The foals were dangerously thin, ribs clearly visible beneath their dull coats. One had a nasty cut on its hind leg, likely from the barbed wire. They stood protectively close to each other, trembling slightly but made no attempt to flee as he approached. "Easy now," he soothed, his voice low and gentle. "Where's your mama, little ones?" The absence of a mare nearby sent a chill down his spine. Wild horses sometimes roamed these parts, but a mare would never voluntarily abandon foals this young. He knelt in the dust, holding out his weathered hand, allowing the foals to catch his scent. After a moment's hesitation, the bolder of the two stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring as it sniffed his fingers. "That's it," Hank encouraged. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The second foal limped forward, the wound on its leg clearly causing pain. Hank's experienced eyes took in their condition: dehydrated, malnourished, and in the case of the injured one, at risk of infection. They wouldn't survive much longer out here alone. As the braver foal tentatively allowed him to stroke its neck, Hank noticed something that made his blood run cold. Around the foal's neck was a weather-worn leather strap, not a natural marking or injury, but a man-made halter that had been there long enough to begin rubbing the skin raw. "You're not wild, are you?" he murmured. The second foal also bore similar marks. These were domestic horses, likely born on someone's ranch, abandoned or lost, but definitely not wild. Hank sat back on his heels, considering the situation. The nearest ranch besides his was the Blackwell place, nearly 15 miles east. These foals couldn't have wandered that far in their condition. Someone had brought them here and left them, deliberately. The thought kindled a slow-burning anger in Hank's chest. In all his years, he'd never understood how some folks could treat animals with such callous disregard. A horse wasn't just livestock to him. It was a partner, deserving of respect and proper care. He stood slowly, making his decision. He couldn't leave them here to die, and they were too weak to make it back to his ranch on their own. He'd have to return with his trailer. "Hang tight, little ones," he said, giving each foal a final gentle stroke. "I'll be back for you." He mounted Buck and rode hard back to the ranch, his mind racing. In the barn, he hitched his old trailer to his equally ancient pickup truck. His ranch hand, Miguel, helped him load water buckets, some feed, and basic medical supplies. "Abandoned?" Miguel asked in disbelief when Hank explained the situation. "Looks that way," Hank replied grimly. "Someone dumped them out there to die." "Who would do such a thing?" Miguel's weathered face creased with concern. "Someone who values money over life," Hank replied, thinking of rumors he'd heard about a new outfit buying up struggling ranches in the next county. They were reportedly cutting corners wherever possible, treating horses as disposable commodities rather than valuable assets worth investing in. An hour later, Hank was back at the ravine, relieved to find the foals exactly where he'd left them. They seemed even more receptive to his presence now, perhaps sensing he represented their only chance at survival. Getting them into the trailer proved easier than expected, their desperation for water and feed overcoming their natural wariness. Once loaded, Hank examined the injured leg more closely. The cut wasn't as deep as he'd feared, but infection had already set in. Back at the ranch, they'd need antibiotics and careful tending. As they bumped along the dirt road toward home, Hank's mind turned to the bigger question: who had abandoned these foals, and why? The economy had been tough on ranchers lately, with drought driving up feed prices, but that was no excuse for such cruelty. He'd made a few calls, asked around. Someone had to know something. In a community this small, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. And if he found who was responsible, well, Hank had never been one to look for trouble, but he believed firmly in justice. The foals would need names, he realized. The stronger one, a colt with a distinctive white blaze on his forehead, he decided to call Chance. The injured filly with gentle eyes that seemed to hold a world of sorrow, he would name Hope. Fitting names for survivors who'd been given a second chance at life. As the ranch buildings came into view, Hank felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Since losing his wife to cancer 3 winters ago, he'd been going through the motions of living without really engaging with life. These foals needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. "Welcome to your new home," he murmured, glancing back at the trailer. "For as long as you need it." By the time Hank backed the trailer up to the small corral adjacent to his barn, Dr. Sarah Reeves, the local veterinarian, was already waiting. She climbed down from her mud-splattered pickup, medical bag in hand. At 35, Sarah had established herself as the most reliable large animal vet in 3 counties, driving countless miles on dirt roads to tend to the region's livestock. "Miguel called," she explained, her keen eyes already assessing the trailer's contents as Hank carefully lowered the ramp. "Said you found some abandoned foals." "Appreciate you coming so quick," Hank replied, leading the first foal down the ramp. "This here's Chance. The filly behind him is Hope. She's got a nasty cut on her back leg." Sarah's expression darkened as she took in the foal's condition. "My God, Hank, they're half-starved." She knelt to examine Hope's injured leg, her touch gentle but confident. "How long do you think they've been out there?" "Hard to say. Given their condition, I'd guess at least a week, maybe longer." With Miguel's help, they settled the foals in a clean stall bedded with fresh straw. Sarah worked methodically, cleaning Hope's wound, administering antibiotics, and checking both foals for other injuries or ailments. She showed Hank how to mix a special rehydration solution and explained the careful feeding regimen they would need to follow. "You can't just give them all they can eat right away," she cautioned. Their systems are too weak, small amounts frequently, gradually increasing. I'll leave you detailed instructions." While she worked, Hank described exactly where and how he'd found them. Sarah's frown deepened as he mentioned the worn halter marks. This was deliberate, Hank. Someone abandoned these foals knowing full well they couldn't survive on their own. Her voice carried the controlled anger of someone who had dedicated her life to healing animals, confronted with needless suffering. "Any idea whose they might be?" Hank asked, stroking Chance's neck as the foal eagerly accepted a small bucket of the rehydration solution. Sarah hesitated, her hand stilling momentarily. "I've heard things. Can't say for certain." She met his gaze directly. "Have you heard about Westland Enterprises buying up the Morrison and Jenkins places?" Hank nodded. Those ranches had been family operations for generations before financial troubles forced them to sell. "Well, I treated some horses for them last month," Sarah continued. "Corporate outfit from Texas. They've brought in a manager named Vance Holloway, who doesn't know the first thing about ranching in Montana conditions. Seems more interested in cutting costs than proper animal care." "You think these might be theirs?" "Can't prove it. But they had a breeding program going with some Palomino quarter horses. Said they were going to streamline operations, whatever that means." She sighed, packing up her supplies. "I'll ask around discreetly. If they are Westlands, we'll need solid proof before making accusations." After Sarah left, Hank and Miguel established a schedule for feeding and monitoring the foals. Every 2 hours, round the clock, one of them would check on the young horses, offering small amounts of feed, ensuring they had water, and watching for any signs of deterioration in their condition. That evening, after the day's work was done, Hank sat on a bale of hay in the barn watching the foals. They had settled somewhat, the immediate hunger and thirst addressed, though true recovery would take weeks of careful attention. Hope's eyes were clearer now, the pain medication providing relief from her wound. Chance had already shown signs of his namesake, a survivor's instinct, pushing forward despite adversity. The barn door creaked open, and Hank's daughter Emma stepped inside. At 28, she was the image of her mother, the same determined chin, the same way of moving with quiet purpose. She taught at the elementary school in town and lived in a small house on the edge of the ranch property, helping out evenings and weekends. "Dad," Miguel told me what happened. She settled beside him on the hay bale, passing him a thermos of coffee. "How are they doing?" "Better than they were," Hank replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Sarah thinks they'll pull through with proper care." Emma studied the foals thoughtfully. Who would do something like this? "Someone who sees animals as just numbers on a spreadsheet," Hank said, the bitterness in his tone unmistakable. Sarah mentioned that new corporate outfit, Westland. They've been buying up struggling ranches. Emma nodded slowly. "One of my students, Lily Morrison. She mentioned her family had to sell to some company. Said her grandpa cried when they took away their horses." She paused. "Her dad got a job in Billings. They're moving next month." The silence between them was heavy with the knowledge that their way of life, ranching families connected to the land for generations, was slowly disappearing, replaced by corporate interests with little understanding of local traditions or conditions. "What are you going to do with them?" Emma finally asked, nodding toward the foals. "Nurse them back to health. After that," Hank shrugged, "guess I'll see if I can find who they belong to. If not, they've got a home here." Emma smiled, the expression warming her tired face. "Mom would approve. She always said you collected strays of all kinds." "That she did," Hank agreed, memories washing over him. Rebecca had been the heart of their home, filling it with warmth and laughter. In the 3 years since her passing, he'd kept the ranch going, but something vital had been missing. Perhaps that explained why these foals had affected him so strongly. their vulnerability awakening the protective instincts that had been dormant since Rebecca's illness. The following morning, while checking water troughs in the north pasture, Hank spotted a dust cloud approaching along the access road. Few people came this way without invitation. He watched as a gleaming black pickup truck with Westland Enterprises emblazoned on the door pulled to a stop. A man in crisp jeans, expensive boots, and a pristine Stetson that had clearly never seen actual ranch work stepped out. Vance Holloway, Hank presumed, the manager Sarah had mentioned. "Morning," the man called with an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Vance Holloway from Westland. Hope you don't mind me stopping by. I'm checking with all the neighboring ranches about some missing stock." Hank's expression remained neutral as he approached, wiping his hands on a bandana. "That right? What kind of stock would that be?" "Couple of Palomino foals," Holloway replied, pulling a tablet from his truck. "About 4 months old, part of our breeding program." He swiped the screen and turned it toward Hank, displaying photos of several Palomino foals in what appeared to be a corporate presentation rather than candid ranch photos. Hank kept his expression carefully neutral. "What happened to them?" Holloway's smile tightened. "Likely stolen. We've had some issues with local troublemakers not appreciating our modern business methods." His tone carried a practiced combination of concern and condescension. "Our security footage shows someone tampering with a fence line last week. Next morning, inventory showed 2 foals missing." "Inventory," Hank repeated, the words sitting like a stone in his mouth. Horses weren't inventory to him. They were living beings deserving of care and respect. "Just ranch terminology," Holloway said smoothly. "We're offering a substantial reward for information. $5,000, no questions asked." He handed Hank a glossy business card. "If you hear anything, I'll keep my eyes open," Hank replied non-committally, pocketing the card. "Though I'm surprised anyone would steal unweaned foals, not exactly ready to ride or sell." A flicker of something, irritation perhaps, or caution crossed Holloway's face. "Corporate accounting requires us to track all assets, even developing ones." "Assets," Hank echoed. "Right." Holloway's gaze drifted toward the barn. "Mind if I look around? Just to be thorough." "Actually, I do mind," Hank said, his voice hardening. "This is private property. If you've got legitimate concerns about theft, take them to Sheriff Patterson." The corporate man's affable mask slipped momentarily. "Mr. Dawson, we're trying to be good neighbors here. Westland has invested significantly in this region. We can make things very beneficial for cooperative local ranchers." The implication hung in the air between them, or very difficult for uncooperative ones. "Appreciate the thought," Hank replied evenly. "But the Triple D's been running fine for 3 generations without corporate partnership." "Times change, Mr. Dawson. Family operations like yours are becoming unsustainable." Holloway glanced pointedly at the weathered buildings, the aging equipment. "Our analysts predict another 2, maybe 3 years before economic pressures force you to sell. Wouldn't it be better to get ahead of that inevitability?" The casual certainty with which he predicted the death of Hank's legacy sent a cold anger through the rancher's veins. "Seems your analysts don't know much about Dawsons. We're stubborn folk." Holloway shrugged, climbing back into his truck. "Stubbornness doesn't pay bills, Mr. Dawson. Efficiency does. I'll be in touch." As the black pickup disappeared in a cloud of dust, Hank stood motionless, processing the interaction. The man hadn't specifically mentioned finding 2 Palominos matching Hope and Chance, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. He headed straight for the barn. Miguel was inside, gently cleaning Hope's wound. "Who was that?" he asked, noting Hank's troubled expression. "Westland's manager, looking for missing foals." Hank knelt beside the stall, studying the foals with new eyes. Their condition told a story very different from theft. These animals hadn't been stolen, they'd been discarded. "You think these are theirs?" Miguel's voice was cautious. Maybe legally, but morally? Hank shook his head. No one who abandons animals like this deserves to get them back. What will you do, Patron? Hank didn't answer immediately, watching as Hope tentatively nuzzled his hand. In just one day, the foals had already begun showing signs of trust. The idea of returning them to people who had abandoned them was unthinkable. Yet harboring them could bring serious legal consequences, accusations of theft, perhaps even criminal charges that could cost him the ranch. "First, we document everything," he finally said. "Their condition when I found them, where exactly they were. Sarah's medical assessment, we need evidence. And then I make some calls, starting with Jim Patterson." Sheriff Jim Patterson had been 3 years behind Hank in school, and they'd maintained a friendly relationship built on mutual respect and the occasional fishing trip. When Hank called, Jim agreed to stop by that evening after his shift. By the time the sheriff's cruiser pulled up beside the barn, Emma had returned from school and was helping with the evening feeding. Hope had managed to stand for nearly 20 minutes earlier, a promising sign, while Chance was already showing more energy, exploring the limits of the stall with cautious curiosity. Jim's weathered face creased with concern as he examined the foals. "Jesus, Hank, they're in rough shape." "Better than yesterday," Hank replied, explaining the circumstances of finding them and Holloway's subsequent visit. The sheriff took meticulous notes, photographed the foal's condition, and collected the worn halter straps as evidence. This is animal cruelty, clear as day. But proving Westland deliberately abandoned them rather than having them stolen is going to be tricky. "Why would anyone steal foals just to abandon them?" Emma asked. "They wouldn't," Jim agreed. "But Westland has deep pockets and a team of lawyers. They'll claim theft or employee misconduct, anything to avoid corporate liability. So they just get away with it?" Hank's frustration was evident. "I didn't say that." Jim's eyes held a determined glint. "I've been hearing troubling things about Westland's operations. This might be the evidence we need to get a warrant for a proper inspection." After the sheriff left, promising to initiate an investigation, Hank sat with the foals while Emma returned to her house to prepare teaching materials for the next day. The barn was quiet, except for the occasional soft nickering of his older horses and the rustling of the foals settling into their straw bedding. "Don't worry," he murmured to them. "You're staying right here." Hope raised her head at the sound of his voice, her eyes carrying a trust that tightened something in Hank's chest. These animals had been through hell, abandoned to die, yet they still had capacity for trust. It was a resilience that reminded him of Rebecca's strength through her illness, how she'd maintained her gentle spirit even as her body failed her. He stayed longer than his scheduled check, simply sitting with them, finding a peace in their presence that had been elusive since Rebecca's passing. Whatever legal battles lay ahead, he knew with absolute certainty that he would fight to keep these foals safe. Some things, Hank reflected as he finally rose to leave, were worth being stubborn about. The following days established a new rhythm at the Triple D. Hank and Miguel took turns with the round-the-clock feeding schedule, while Emma helped whenever she wasn't teaching. Hope's wound was healing well, the infection receding thanks to Sarah's antibiotics and careful tending. Chance grew stronger daily, his curious personality emerging as he gained confidence. On the 4th morning after finding the foals, Hank was in the barn mixing their special feed when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the open door, he spotted Sarah's truck pulling up alongside a weathered blue sedan he recognized as belonging to Martha Jenkins, whose family had recently sold their ranch to Westland. "Morning, Hank," Sarah called as she entered, medical bag in hand for the foals checkup. Behind her, Martha Jenkins moved more hesitantly, her once proud posture now burdened with invisible weight. "Martha," Hank nodded respectfully. "Good to see you." The woman was in her 60s, her face lined with the distinctive weathering that came from decades of ranch work. The Jenkins place had been one of the first homesteads in the valley, dating back to the 1890s. "Sarah thought I should come," Martha said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone moving through grief. "Said you found some palominos." "That's right." Hank led them to the stall where the foals were resting. Martha's weathered hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh God, those are Belle's babies." "You recognize them?" Sarah asked gently. Martha nodded, kneeling slowly by the stall. "The colt has that perfect diamond on his forehead. The filly has her mama's gentle eyes. We bred Belle to Sundance last spring before—" She trailed off, her hand reaching through the slats to gently stroke Chance's neck. The foal approached cautiously, sniffing her hand. "Before Westland bought your place," Hank finished for her. "They said they'd keep our breeding program intact," Martha said bitterly. 5 generations of selective breeding, our bloodlines were known 3 states over, but once the papers were signed—" She shook her head. "They started shipping horses out, said they were consolidating assets." "What about these foals' mother?" Sarah asked. "Belle was pregnant with twins, rare for horses and risky. We were giving her special care." Martha's voice hardened. 2 days after Westland took over, I drove by and saw they'd put her in with the regular herd. No special feed, no monitoring. I confronted that snake Holloway, and he said their efficiency protocols didn't allow for preferential resource allocation. Hank's jaw tightened. "What happened to Belle?" "She died foaling." The simple statement carried immeasurable pain. "My husband John had warned them it could happen without proper care. These 2 survived, barely. Last I heard, they were in the sick pen. Then Holloway claimed they were stolen." She looked up at Hank, her eyes sharp with understanding. "But they weren't stolen, were they?" "Found them by my north fence line," Hank confirmed. "Abandoned, half-starved." Martha's expression transformed from grief to cold fury. "Those heartless corporate bastards. They probably decided caring for orphaned foals wasn't cost-effective. Easier to dump them and claim theft for the insurance." Sarah took photos as Martha identified specific markings that proved the foal's lineage. She signed a statement confirming their identity and her certainty that they came from the Jenkins breeding program, now owned by Westland. "This should help Jim's investigation," Sarah said, tucking the documentation into her bag. After completing the checkup and confirming the foal's improving health, Sarah left for her next appointment. Martha lingered, watching the foals with a mixture of relief and sadness. "John would be grateful," she said quietly. "He loved those horses more than anything." "How is John doing?" Hank asked. Martha's husband had been hospitalized with a stroke just before they sold the ranch. Better some days than others. The stroke affected his speech. He understands everything, but finding words is hard. She sighed. "The hardest part is when he asks about the horses. I haven't had the heart to tell him what Westland's done to our life's work." Hank nodded, understanding too well how a lifetime of dedication could be dismantled by corporate efficiency in mere weeks. "Martha, if you don't mind me asking, what happened? Your place was doing well last I heard." "Medical bills," she said simply. "When John had the stroke, our insurance covered some, but not enough. Then the drought hit, feed costs doubled, and the bank started making noise about our mortgage. Westland offered cash, enough to pay off our debts and afford John's rehabilitation." Her voice carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining the inevitable. "We didn't have children to pass the ranch to. Seemed like the sensible choice at the time." "I'm sorry," Hank said, meaning it. "Not your burden to carry." She straightened her shoulders, some of her old resilience returning. "But these foals, they matter. They're the last of our bloodlines. Westland has no right to them after what they've done. Holloway came by yesterday looking for them. Of course he did. The insurance payout would be substantial. Those foals are registered with the American Quarter Horse Association. Their bloodlines make them valuable. Martha's words confirmed what Hank had suspected. Westland had deliberately abandoned the foals, probably assuming they would die and never be traced back to the company. With the evidence of theft they had manufactured, they could then file an insurance claim for valuable breeding stock. "What are you going to do, Hank?" Martha asked. "Keep them safe until Jim's investigation is complete," he replied. "After that, we'll see." That afternoon, while the foals napped, Hank drove into town to meet Sheriff Patterson at the small diner on Main Street. Jim was waiting in a corner booth, a stack of files beside his coffee cup. "Got some interesting information," the sheriff said, as Hank settled across from him. "Martha Jenkins's statement helps. We've also had complaints from 3 former Westland employees about animal welfare violations. Enough for that warrant?" "Working on it. Judge Carlton wants more before he'll sign off on a full inspection of Westland's operation." Jim slid a file across the table. "Meanwhile, their legal department filed this morning." Hank opened the folder to find a formal demand letter claiming he had unlawfully obtained Westland property and demanding the immediate return of 2 Palomino foals along with compensation for veterinary expenses and emotional distress. Emotional distress? Hank couldn't hide his disgust. They abandoned those foals to die. They're claiming a disgruntled employee took the foals without authorization. Holloway's saying they've been searching desperately for the animals and are relieved they've been found. That's bull, and you know it. I know it, Jim agreed. Proving it is different. Corporate operations like Westland are experts at creating plausible deniability. They'll sacrifice some low-level employee as a scapegoat while the company keeps its hands clean. So what now? Now, Jim said, his expression hardening with determination. We build a stronger case. By the end of the first week, the transformation in the foals was remarkable. Hope could now stand for hours, her wound healing cleanly with only a faint scar likely to remain. Chance had regained enough strength to prance around the expanded enclosure Hank and Miguel had created, connecting the stall to a small outdoor pen where the foals could feel the sun on their backs. Sarah declared them officially out of danger during her latest checkup, though they still required special feeding and care to fully recover from their ordeal. The vet had documented their progress meticulously, creating a detailed record that would serve as evidence in any legal proceedings. They're fighters, Hank remarked to Emma as they watched Chance attempt a clumsy buck, his growing energy seeking outlet in playful movements. Like someone else I know, she replied with a sideways glance at her father. Hank had received 2 more formal communications from Westland's legal department, each more threatening than the last. The latest warned of imminent legal action if the foals weren't surrendered immediately. He'd passed them straight to Jim Patterson, adding them to the growing file of evidence. That afternoon, a caravan of 3 vehicles kicked up dust on the approach to the Triple D. Hank recognized Jim's cruiser in the lead, followed by a county animal control truck and a sedan bearing government plates. "Expecting company?" Miguel asked, pausing in his work repairing tack. "Not exactly," Hank replied, walking out to meet the visitors. Jim stepped out first, his expression grim. "Sorry about this, Hank. They insisted on coming out here officially." From the sedan emerged a thin man in his 40s, wearing a suit that looked uncomfortable in the rural setting. "Thomas Brewer, Department of Agriculture," he introduced himself, presenting identification. "I'm here to inspect 2 Palomino foals allegedly stolen from Westland Enterprises." The animal control officer, a local woman named Diane, whom Hank knew from community events, looked apologetic as she approached. "Standard procedure for disputed livestock, Hank." "They're in the barn," Hank said, leading the way. But they weren't stolen, they were abandoned. "So you claim," Brewer replied neutrally. "My job is just to confirm their identity and welfare." Inside the barn, Hope and Chance were resting in the straw. At the entrance of strangers, Chance positioned himself protectively in front of the still recuperating Hope, a behavior that brought an unexpected lump to Hank's throat. Even as foals, they understood loyalty and protection. Brewer methodically photographed the foals, checked their condition against veterinary reports Sarah had filed, and examined them for identifying markings. He worked silently, making notes on a tablet. "Their condition has improved significantly," he finally commented, "but these photos from the initial discovery..." He shook his head. "Clear signs of severe neglect. Which is why this investigation is ongoing," Jim added pointedly. "Nevertheless, ownership must be established." Brewer straightened up. "The microchip data confirms these animals are registered to Westland Enterprises following their acquisition of Jenkins Ranch assets." Hank's heart sank. Despite knowing this was likely, hearing it officially stated made the threat of losing the foals suddenly, painfully real. "So you're taking them," he said flatly. "Not today," Brewer replied, surprising him. Given their medical condition and ongoing recovery, moving them would pose unnecessary risk. They'll remain here under a custody order until ownership is legally resolved. "However," he added, his tone becoming formal, "you are now officially custodian rather than possessor. You cannot sell, transfer, or permanently alter these animals until legal proceedings are complete." After the officials left, Hank sat heavily on a hay bale, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. The foals sensed his mood, Chance approaching to nudge his hand gently while Hope watched with those expressive eyes that seemed to understand far more than a young horse should. "We're not giving up," he told them quietly, stroking Chance's soft muzzle. That evening, Martha Jenkins returned, this time with her husband John. The older man moved slowly with a walker, his left side showing the slight droop characteristic of stroke survivors. His eyes, however, were clear and alert. "He wanted to see them," Martha explained as Hank helped John navigate to the stall. "Wouldn't take no for an answer." John's face transformed as he gazed at the foals. With his good hand, he gestured insistently until Hank opened the stall door and helped him sit on a small stool inside. Chance approached cautiously while Hope watched from a distance. "Bells," John managed, tears welling in his eyes as he gently stroked Chance's neck. "Yes, love. Belle's babies," Martha confirmed, her own voice thick with emotion. "Hank saved them." John turned to Hank, struggling to form words. After several attempts, he simply grasped Hank's hand and squeezed it with surprising strength, his eyes conveying what his impaired speech could not. "No need for thanks," Hank said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Martha contradicted. "Not anyone. Most would have looked the other way, called animal control, and washed their hands of it. You took responsibility." After the Jenkins left, Emma arrived with an unexpected visitor, Lily Morrison, the 10-year-old student whose family had also sold their ranch to Westland. "She wanted to see the foals," Emma explained. "Her parents said it was okay." The little girl approached the pen with reverent caution. "We had horses too," she said softly, "but the company took them away." "Would you like to help feed them?" Hank offered. The girl's face lit up as he showed her how to hold the special feed bucket for Chance, who gently ate from her small hands. "They're getting better," she observed with a child's direct perception. "They were really sick, but now they're almost happy." "Almost," Hank agreed. Something about the child's innocent assessment struck him deeply. These foals had survived abandonment and were physically recovering, but there was still a wariness in their eyes, a hesitation in their movements that spoke of deeper wounds. Later that night, unable to sleep, Hank returned to the barn for an unscheduled check. The foals were awake, watching him enter with their now familiar recognition. He settled on the straw beside them, speaking softly about nothing in particular, just letting them become accustomed to human presence that demanded nothing and offered comfort. Hope, typically the more cautious of the pair, gradually inched closer until she finally rested her head against his shoulder, exhaling a soft breath that seemed to carry the weight of her short but difficult life. Chance stood protectively nearby, not yet ready for such vulnerability, but watching with growing trust. Under the soft glow of the barn's single light, Hank made a silent promise to these creatures who had unexpectedly become so important. Whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever it took, he would ensure they never knew abandonment or cruelty again. 2 weeks after finding the foals, Hank received an unexpected visitor. A dusty pickup with Montana plates pulled into the yard late afternoon as he was finishing repairs on an irrigation pump. The driver, a lean man in his 30s with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, approached cautiously. "Mr. Dawson? My name's Tyler Reynolds. I used to work for Westland." Hank studied the man, noting his nervous demeanor and the way his eyes kept darting toward the barn. "Used to. Got fired last week. Officially for protocol violations, really because I wouldn't keep my mouth shut about what they're doing to those animals." Hank led him into the barn where they could speak privately, away from potential eyes on the road. Inside, the foals perked up at the newcomer's presence, Chance positioning himself protectively in front of Hope, as had become his habit. "Jesus," Reynolds muttered, taking in their improved but still recovering condition. "They actually survived. You know these two?" Reynolds nodded, keeping a respectful distance from the stall. "I was there the night Belle died foaling. Those twins were barely alive. Holloway ordered them put down, said orphaned twins weren't worth the expense of hand-raising." "But they weren't put down," Hank prompted. "No. The ranch hand assigned to do it, Carlos Mendez. He couldn't go through with it. Figured he'd smuggle them to a rescue instead." Reynolds swallowed hard. But Holloway caught wind something was happening. Carlos panicked, left the foals somewhere remote, figuring someone might find them. "By my north fence line." "Must have been. Carlos disappeared that night, left without collecting his final check. No one's heard from him since." The implication hung heavy in the air. Whether Carlos had fled out of fear or something worse had happened, it was clear Westland would go to great lengths to protect their interests. "Why are you telling me this now?" Hank asked. Reynolds rubbed his face tiredly. "Because what Westland's doing isn't just business. It's wrong. They're running those ranches into the ground, treating animals like equipment, employees like disposable parts." He pulled out his phone. "I've got proof. Photos, videos, internal emails about cost-cutting measures that violate every animal welfare standard in the book." He showed Hank dozens of images: overcrowded pens, malnourished horses, sick animals left untreated. One video showed Holloway explicitly ordering workers to reduce feed rations below recommended minimums to maximize profit margins. "Sheriff Patterson needs to see this," Hank said. "Already sent copies to him this morning," Reynolds confirmed. "And to state authorities. I'm headed to Helena tomorrow to give a formal statement. Westland will come after you." The younger man's jaw tightened. "Let them. My grandfather taught me ranching. Real ranching, where you respect the land and the animals in your care. What Westland's doing is a perversion of everything that way of life stands for." After Reynolds left, promising to keep in touch through Sheriff Patterson, Hank called Jim to confirm the new evidence had arrived. The sheriff was cautiously optimistic. "Reynolds' testimony could be the breakthrough we need," Jim said. "Especially those emails showing corporate directives to cut corners on animal care. I'm meeting with the county prosecutor tomorrow." That evening, as Hank sat with Emma on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, He filled her in on the day's developments. "Do you think it'll be enough?" she asked. "To shut Westland down?" "Probably not. These corporate outfits have lawyers on retainer specifically to get them out of trouble. But enough to keep the Foals? Maybe." Emma studied her father's profile in the fading light. "This is about more than just those two foals, isn't it?" Hank considered the question, watching a hawk circle lazily over the pasture. "It's about drawing a line," he said finally, "saying there are some things that matter more than profit margins. Like Mom always said, some fights choose you, not the other way around." "She would have been first in that barn nursing those foals," Hank said softly, the memory of Rebecca's fierce compassion for injured creatures still vivid after all these years. "She would be proud of you, Dad." The next morning brought another round of special feed for the foals, who were now strong enough to venture further into the small paddock. Hope's limp was barely noticeable, and Chance had developed an endearing habit of nickering softly whenever Hank approached. Miguel, who had initially maintained professional distance from the recuperating animals, now spent his breaks sitting near their enclosure, quietly talking to them in Spanish. When Hank raised an eyebrow, the ranch hand simply shrugged. "My grandmother believed animals understand more than we think," he explained, "especially ones who have suffered. They need to hear kind words to heal their spirits, not just their bodies." By mid-morning, Sarah arrived for her regular checkup, bringing unexpected news. Jim called. "Judge Carlton signed the warrant. They're inspecting Westland's facilities today, all 3 ranches they've acquired." "About time," Hank said, helping her carry supplies to the barn. Reynolds' evidence made the difference. Plus, 2 more former employees came forward after hearing he'd spoken up. The examination confirmed the foals' continued improvement. "They're young," Sarah noted, packing up her equipment. "They'll recover fully with proper care, physically at least." "And the other part? That's harder to measure. Animals remember trauma, especially herd animals like horses. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild." She glanced at him thoughtfully. "Though you seem to have made remarkable progress there already." That afternoon, while working on fence repairs in the east pasture, Hank spotted 3 vehicles racing up the access road. Holloway's black pickup followed by 2 unmarked SUVs. His stomach tightened as he mounted Buck and rode quickly back to the ranch buildings. He arrived to find Holloway and 2 men in expensive suits confronting Miguel outside the barn. The corporate manager's face was flushed with anger. "This is harassment," Holloway was shouting as Hank dismounted. "You have no right to block access to Westland property." "Mr. Dawson has the custody order," Miguel replied calmly, standing his ground in the barn doorway. "No one touches those foals without Sheriff Patterson present." "There he is now," one of the suited men said as Hank approached. "Mr. Dawson, I'm Lawrence Green, Chief Legal Counsel for Westland Enterprises. We're here to collect our property following the Department of Agriculture's confirmation of ownership." "You have paperwork overriding the custody order?" Hank asked. "The inspection of our facilities this morning was completely satisfactory," Green declared, ignoring the question. "There's no legal basis to continue withholding valuable Westland assets." "Then you won't mind waiting for the sheriff to confirm that," Hank replied evenly. "I've already called him." Holloway stepped forward, his carefully maintained corporate facade cracking. "Those foals aren't worth what this is costing us in legal fees. Just hand them over now, and we can all move on." "Not worth it?" Hank's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that why you abandoned them to die? Because nursing orphaned foals wasn't cost-effective?" Green shot Holloway a warning look. No one at Westland authorized abandoning any animals. If that occurred, it was the unauthorized action of a single employee who has since disappeared. "Convenient," Hank said. The standoff continued until Jim Patterson's cruiser appeared, followed by the animal control truck. The sheriff's expression was grim as he approached the group. "Gentlemen," he greeted them, "I believe we have some matters to discuss." Sheriff Patterson motioned Hank aside while Diane from Animal Control positioned her truck to block any attempt at removing the foals. "The inspection didn't go well for Westland," Jim murmured, low enough that the corporate representatives couldn't hear. "Found numerous violations across all 3 properties: overcrowding, inadequate feed, untreated medical conditions. But their lawyers are already spinning it as administrative oversights rather than systemic problems. So they're still trying to take the foals. Legally, they still own them. The custody order just determines who cares for them during the investigation." Jim's eyes reflected his frustration. These corporate types, they operate in a different world. Everything's an asset with a dollar value, and emotions don't factor into decisions. Hank watched as Green spoke intently into his phone, gesturing emphatically. Holloway paced nearby, his pristine Western wear looking increasingly out of place as his composure deteriorated. "What now?" Hank asked. "Now we follow procedure. Diane documents the foal's current condition. I inform these gentlemen that removing animals under a custody order is a criminal offense, and we wait for the county prosecutor to determine if animal cruelty charges are warranted based on today's inspection." Green finished his call and approached, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. "Sheriff Patterson, I've just spoken with Judge Harriman. He's prepared to issue an emergency order superseding your custody arrangement." Jim's expression didn't change, though Hank noticed his hand shifting slightly closer to his service weapon. "Judge Harriman doesn't have jurisdiction in this county, Mr. Green, and attempting to remove those animals before legal proceedings are complete would constitute interference with an active investigation." "This is ridiculous," Holloway interjected. "You're talking about 2 horses, replaceable assets." "Those replaceable assets nearly died because of your company's neglect," Hank said, his patience finally snapping. "And based on what we've heard from your former employees, that neglect is standard operating procedure for Westland." Green stepped between them. "Mr. Dawson, I'd advise against making unfounded allegations that could be construed as defamatory. Westland Enterprises is committed to ethical livestock management practices." "Is that what you call abandoning foals to die?" Hank countered. "Or ordering feed rations cut below minimum requirements to improve profit margins?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Green's face. "I don't know what you're referring to." "I think you do." Jim pulled out his phone, displaying one of the emails Reynolds had provided. This directive came directly from Westland corporate headquarters, authorizing aggressive cost containment measures, including reducing feed by 40% below industry standards. For the first time, Green appeared genuinely caught off guard. "Where did you get that?" "Same place we got videos of Mr. Holloway here instructing employees to ignore sick animals that weren't investment priorities," Jim replied calmly. "Former employees with consciences, Mr. Green. Turns out there are still some of those in your industry." Green recovered quickly. "Sheriff, whatever documentation you've obtained will need to be authenticated. Disgruntled former employees aren't the most reliable witnesses." "That's for the courts to decide," Jim replied. "Meanwhile, those foals stay right where they are." After a tense standoff, the Westland representatives departed, promising further legal action. As their vehicles disappeared down the driveway, Hank exhaled slowly, the adrenaline of confrontation leaving him drained. "They'll be back," Jim warned, "with more lawyers and probably a judge in their pocket." "What are their chances?" "Honestly, better than ours. They've got resources we don't. But we've got something they can't buy." "What's that?" "The truth. And if Reynolds' testimony holds up, evidence of corporate-directed animal cruelty, that goes far beyond these two foals. That evening, Martha Jenkins called with news from her neighbor whose son worked at the county courthouse. Judge Carlton had signed orders for an expanded investigation into all of Westland's Montana operations following the initial inspection findings. "They're sending in state veterinarians tomorrow," she reported. "A whole team of them to document conditions at all 3 ranches." While this was encouraging, Hank remained cautious. Corporate entities like Westland often manage to wriggle out of accountability through legal maneuvering and strategic settlements. He spent an extra hour with the foals that night, watching their steadily increasing confidence as they explored their enclosure. Chance had developed a particular fascination with a red rubber ball Emma had brought, pushing it around with his nose in curious investigation. Hope, true to her gentler nature, seemed content to observe his antics, occasionally nickering softly as if encouraging his play. "You two have come a long way," Hank murmured, leaning against the fence post. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled his attention away. Emma's small car pulled up, and she emerged looking troubled. "Lily Morrison's dad called," she said without preamble. "Westland representatives went to their apartment in Billings this afternoon, offered him his old job back with a significant raise if he'd sign an affidavit stating the ranching conditions were excellent under their management." "Did he take it?" Emma's expression softened. "He told them he didn't need a job that required him to lie." Then Lily apparently added that abandoned horses don't come from good ranches. Hank couldn't help the proud smile that crossed his face. Smart kid. She also said her class is making get-well cards for Hope and Chance. They want to visit next week if that's okay. The thought of school children connecting with the foals story touched something deep in Hank. These animals weren't just surviving. They were becoming symbols of something larger: resilience, compassion, the importance of standing firm against corporate callousness. "Of course it's okay," he said. Later that night, unable to sleep, Hank found himself drawn once again to the barn. The quiet hours after midnight had always been his time for reflection, ever since Rebecca's passing had left him with too many thoughts and an empty house. The foals were sleeping peacefully, Chance protectively positioned beside Hope, as always. In the soft glow of the night light, Hank could see how their coats had begun to regain luster, their frames filling out as proper nutrition replaced starvation. His phone buzzed with a text from Jim Patterson. "Reynolds testified in Helena today. State AG's office taking interest. Corporate HQ in Texas apparently scrambling. Watch your back." The warning was unnecessary. Hank had lived long enough to know that corporations backed into corners became dangerous. Westland wouldn't simply walk away from valuable assets or potentially damaging litigation. As if sensing his troubled thoughts, Hope stirred, lifting her head to regard him with those soulful eyes that had given her her name. She nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry both question and reassurance. "It's all right, girl," Hank said quietly. "We're in this together now." And in that moment of connection, he realized that whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever pressure Westland brought to bear, he had already made his choice. These animals had fought too hard to survive. He couldn't let them down. The following days brought a flurry of legal activity as Westland's corporate machinery shifted into high gear. Judge Carlton received a formal request for recusal from Westland's attorneys, claiming bias against corporate agricultural operations. When he refused, they filed an emergency appeal to have the custody order overturned. Meanwhile, news of the abandoned foals had spread beyond their small community. A regional newspaper ran a feature story titled, "Local Rancher Stands Against Corporate Cruelty," complete with before and after photos of Hope and Chance. The article quoted Tyler Reynolds extensively about Westland's practices, alongside statements from Martha Jenkins about the generations of careful breeding that had produced the Foals bloodlines. Hank avoided reporters, uncomfortable with attention, but Emma embraced the opportunity to advocate for the animals. Her classroom had become an impromptu headquarters for what her students called Operation Foal Rescue, creating a wall of hand-drawn cards and learning about responsible animal husbandry in the process. Public opinion matters in cases like this, Sarah explained when she stopped by for her regular checkup. Corporations hate negative publicity more than fines. The veterinarian's assessment confirmed the foal's continued improvement. Hope's wound had healed completely, leaving only a small scar, and both animals had gained appropriate weight. More importantly, their behavior showed increasing confidence and trust. Chance no longer positioned himself protectively in front of Hope when strangers approached, though he remained watchful. Hope had begun seeking out human contact rather than merely tolerating it. "They're young enough that this experience won't define them," Sarah said, watching as Hope gently lipped at Hank's sleeve. "With continued proper care, they'll grow into well-adjusted horses." That afternoon, Jim Patterson arrived with both good and troubling news. "The state investigation is expanding," he reported. "They've found similar conditions at Westland operations in Wyoming and Idaho. Looks like this is company policy, not isolated incidents." "That should strengthen our case," Hank said. "It does, but it also raises the stakes for them. Their legal team is pulling out all the stops. They've filed motions in 3 different courts trying to get the foals returned, and the investigation shut down." Jim's expression was grim. "And there's more. Tyler Reynolds' truck was vandalized last night. All 4 tires slashed, liar painted on the hood." "Intimidation tactics," Hank muttered. "Classic corporate playbook. Can't legally threaten whistleblowers, but can sure make their lives difficult through unofficial channels." Jim hesitated. "Hank, I'm concerned about your security out here. You're isolated, and Westland has a lot to lose if this case continues to build." "I'm not exactly defenseless, Jim. I know that. But these aren't local rustlers or troublemakers. Corporate enforcers play by different rules." After Jim left, Hank walked his property, assessing vulnerabilities with new eyes. The Triple D was indeed isolated, the nearest neighbor over 2 miles away. While he kept firearms for ranch protection and had Miguel living in the bunkhouse, a determined intruder could cause significant damage before being detected. That evening, he installed additional security lights around the barn and moved the foals to a stall with a direct sight line from his bedroom window. Miguel volunteered to sleep in the tack room for extra security, an offer Hank gratefully accepted. These precautions proved prescient when shortly after midnight, Buck's distinctive warning when he alerted Hank to intruders. He grabbed his shotgun and moved quietly to the window, where he spotted 2 figures in dark clothing approaching the barn. A black SUV with tinted windows idled on the access road, its lights off. Hank called Jim immediately, then roused Miguel via the 2-way radio they'd set up between the house and barn. "We've got company," he said quietly. 2 approaching the barn from the south, vehicle waiting on the road. "I see them," Miguel replied, his voice tense but controlled. "What's the plan?" "Sheriff's on the way. We contain the situation without escalating if possible." Hank moved outside, using the shadows for cover, positioning himself to intercept the intruders before they reached the barn. He could see Miguel now, similarly concealed on the opposite side of the yard. The figures moved with practiced efficiency, avoiding the security lights, clearly familiar with ranch layouts. As they neared the barn door, Hank stepped into view, shotgun raised but pointed skyward. "That's far enough," he called, voice steady. The intruders froze momentarily, then one reached inside his jacket. Miguel emerged from his position, rifle trained on the second figure. "I wouldn't," Hank warned. "Sheriff's already on his way, and we've got you covered from both sides." For a tense moment, it could have gone either way. Then distant sirens broke the standoff, and the figures bolted toward their vehicle. Hank considered firing a warning shot but decided against escalation. Instead, he noted details: build, movement patterns, the license plate of the SUV as it sped away. Jim arrived minutes later with 2 deputies, immediately broadcasting an alert for the vehicle. "Professional job," he observed, examining the bolt cutters and sedatives the intruders had dropped in their hasty retreat. These weren't random thugs. They came prepared to extract specific assets. "The Foals," Hank confirmed. "Westland's getting desperate. They know the evidence is mounting." By morning, the SUV had been found abandoned 20 miles away, wiped clean of prints, and registered to a shell company that, with some investigation, would likely trace back to Westland through a labyrinth of corporate entities. Emma arrived at breakfast time, having heard about the incident from Jim's daughter. "You could have been killed," she said, her face pale with delayed fear. "Wasn't their goal," Hank replied, pouring her coffee. "They wanted the Foals, not a confrontation." "This time," she said pointedly. "What about next time?" There was no easy answer. The Foals represented more than just valuable breeding stock now. They were evidence in a case that threatened Westland's entire operational model across multiple states. Martha Jenkins called mid-morning with news that the state attorney general's office had officially launched a multi-jurisdiction investigation into Westland's animal welfare practices. John's physical therapist heard it from her sister, who works at the AG's office, she reported. "They're sending investigators to every Westland facility in the Northwest." While this development increased the likelihood of justice for the abandoned foals, it also raised the stakes dangerously. Corporations facing substantial legal threats rarely surrendered without exhausting every option, legitimate or otherwise. That afternoon, Hank sat with the foals in the afternoon sunshine, watching them explore the larger paddock he'd prepared. Despite last night's events, they seemed relaxed, unaware of the human conflict swirling around them. Chance playfully nudged his red ball while Hope grazed peacefully nearby. Looking at them now, healthy and increasingly happy, Hank found renewed resolve. Whatever came next, he would ensure these animals remained safe, not just for their sake, but for everything they had come to represent in the larger fight against corporate disregard for life beyond profit margins. 3 days after the attempted theft, Lawrence Green himself arrived at the Triple D, this time without Holloway, but accompanied by a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Richard Keller, Executive Vice President of Operations for Westland. "Mr. Dawson," Keller began once they were seated at Hank's kitchen table, "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. I've come to offer a resolution that benefits everyone." Hank said nothing, simply waiting. Emma, who had insisted on being present, sat beside him, her expression guarded. "Westland Enterprises values its reputation," Keller continued smoothly. "The unfortunate situation with these foals appears to stem from unauthorized actions by certain employees who have since been terminated." "Convenient," Emma murmured. "We're prepared to make this right," Keller pressed on. "Westland is offering to donate the foals to your care permanently, Mr. Dawson. Full ownership transfer, no strings attached." He slid a document across the table. "Along with this compensation for your troubles and expenses." Hank glanced at the check attached to the paperwork. The amount was substantial, enough to replace his aging tractor and make critical repairs to the ranch infrastructure. "In exchange?" he asked, though he already knew. "A non-disclosure agreement. The matter concludes here, with no further public discussion of how the foals came into your possession." Green added, "The state investigations would continue their course, of course. This settlement pertains only to your personal involvement." Hank studied the men across from him. Green's thinly veiled desperation beneath professional composure. Keller's practiced corporate smile that never reached his eyes. This wasn't about the Foals anymore. This was damage control, an attempt to silence a particularly visible and sympathetic aspect of a broader case against their operations. "What about Tyler Reynolds?" Hank asked. "And the other whistleblowers? Do they get similar deals? Or does Westland continue making their lives difficult?" Keller's smile tightened. "Our dealings with former employees are separate matters. And Martha and John Jenkins? Do they get compensation for the breeding program Westland dismantled after promising to maintain it?" "Mr. Dawson," Green interjected, "this offer addresses your specific situation only. It's quite generous under the circumstances." Emma leaned forward. "It's hush money. You're not offering this because it's right. You're offering it because those Foals have become the face of your company's cruelty, and every day they remain in the news damages your brand." Keller's mask slipped momentarily, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Ms. Dawson, businesses must consider public relations. That doesn't invalidate a mutually beneficial arrangement." Hank stood, indicating the meeting was over. "The Foals aren't for sale, and neither is my silence." After they departed, Emma looked at her father with concern. "That was a lot of money to turn down, Dad. The ranch could use it." "Some things cost more than money," Hank replied simply. That afternoon, Sheriff Patterson confirmed what Hank had suspected. Westland was approaching each witness individually, offering settlements contingent on silence. "Classic divide and conquer," Jim explained. "If they can fragment the case into isolated incidents with separate settlements, each covered by NDAs, they control the narrative. The systemic nature of the problem disappears." "Are people taking the deals?" "Some are. Hard to blame them. Most aren't in financial positions to refuse." Jim sighed. "But Reynolds is holding firm, and so far the Jenkins haven't signed anything." The state investigation continued despite Westland's efforts to compartmentalize the cases. By week's end, preliminary findings revealed consistent patterns of neglect across multiple Westland properties, suggesting corporate policy rather than individual employee misconduct. Meanwhile, the Foals continued their remarkable recovery. Sarah declared them fully rehabilitated physically, though she noted they would likely always be smaller than they should have been due to the critical developmental weeks spent malnourished. "Their personalities have really emerged," she observed, as Chance playfully tried to remove her hat, while Hope gently nuzzled Hank's pocket for treats. "It's amazing how resilient young animals can be with proper care." Lily Morrison's class visited that Friday, 20 excited third graders carefully approaching the paddock under Emma's supervision. The children had prepared carrots and apples, cut into appropriate sizes, which Hank helped them offer to the increasingly social foals. "They don't look scared anymore," Lily observed as Hope gently took a carrot piece from her small hand. "They're learning to trust again," Hank explained. "Takes time, but they're getting there. My dad says Westland offered him money to say nice things about them," the girl continued with the disarming directness of children. "He told them he'd rather be poor with his self-respect than rich without it." The statement, delivered with such innocent conviction, struck Hank deeply. It articulated something he'd felt but hadn't put into words about his own decision to refuse Westland's offer. That evening, Martha called with news that sent ripples through their small community. The Jenkins had filed a lawsuit against Westland for breach of contract, specifically citing provisions in their sale agreement that required the company to maintain their established breeding programs. John insisted, she explained, her voice stronger than Hank had heard in weeks. Said if he couldn't save all the horses, he could at least fight for Belle's babies and what they represent. The weekend brought unexpected support from another quarter when 3 neighboring ranchers arrived at the Triple D, trucks loaded with hay, feed, and fencing materials. "Heard you might need some help securing the place," Bill Hargrove explained gruffly. The taciturn rancher had rarely spoken more than a few words to Hank at cattle auctions over the years, Figured extra hands wouldn't hurt. By Sunday evening, they had installed additional security lights, reinforced gates, and established a rotating watch schedule. The message was clear. The community was rallying around their own against outside threats. It's not just about the Foals anymore, Bill observed as they shared coffee after a long day's work. It's about what they represent. If corporations can just roll in here, buy up family ranches, and discard generations of work and care for quick profit, what's left of our way of life? Hank knew he was right. Hope and chance had become symbols in a larger struggle between fundamentally different values: community versus corporation, stewardship versus exploitation, a way of life versus the bottom line. That night he sat with the Foals under a sky brilliant with stars, the kind of clear Montana night that reminded a person of their small place in a vast universe. Hope rested her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that still amazed him given what she'd endured. Chance stood nearby, playfully pawing at the ground before settling beside them. Whatever came next in the legal battles and corporate maneuvering, Hank knew with absolute certainty that these animals would remain under his protection. Some commitments transcended legal documents and ownership papers. Some connections, once formed, couldn't be severed by corporate decree or financial pressure. 4 months after finding the abandoned foals, Hank stood in the early morning light watching them graze in the pasture. The transformation was remarkable. Their golden coats now gleamed with health. Their frames had filled out with proper nutrition, and their movements showed the natural grace of young horses unburdened by past trauma. The legal battle with Westland had reached its conclusion the previous week, not with the dramatic courtroom showdown some had anticipated, but with a series of settlements that acknowledged wrongdoing while limiting corporate liability, the typical endgame when powerful entities faced sufficient pressure to require action, but maintained enough influence to control outcomes. Westland had agreed to implement comprehensive animal welfare protocols across all their operations, submit to 5 years of independent monitoring, and pay substantial fines. They had also, in separate agreements, compensated the Jenkins and other families whose breeding programs had been dismantled despite contractual protections. Most significantly for Hank, they had formally relinquished all claim to hope and chance, acknowledging in carefully worded legal language that the company bore responsibility for the conditions that had led to their abandonment. Tyler Reynolds and the other whistleblowers had received settlements that included non-disclosure provisions about specific corporate communications, but allowed them to discuss the general conditions they had witnessed. Reynolds had already found work with a family-owned ranch in the next county, his integrity earning him respect in the community, despite Westland's attempts to discredit him. Vance Holloway had been quietly transferred to corporate headquarters in Texas, not fired but removed from direct operational control of Westland's Montana properties. The company had issued carefully crafted statements about restructuring management to better align with regional agricultural practices, corporate speak that nevertheless represented a victory of sorts. "Penny for your thoughts," Emma said, joining Hank at the fence line. She handed him a mug of coffee, steam rising in the crisp autumn air. "Just thinking how far they've come," he replied, nodding toward the foals, though they were hardly foals anymore, having grown into yearlings with distinctive personalities and habits. Chance had developed into a spirited young horse with boundless energy and playful intelligence. He still loved his red ball, now battered from months of attention, and had discovered an inexplicable fascination with hats, trying to remove them from any visitor who came within reach. Hope, true to her gentler nature, remained more reserved but had blossomed in her own quiet way. She had formed a particular bond with John Jenkins, who visited weekly as part of his rehabilitation. His doctors attributed his improved speech and mobility partly to the motivation these visits provided. "The school board approved the program," Emma said, interrupting Hank's reflections. "Starting next month, we'll bring small groups of students out here twice a week. Equine-assisted learning, they're calling it officially. The educational program had been Emma's idea, using hope and chance to teach children about animal care, responsibility, and resilience. Lily Morrison and her classmates had served as an enthusiastic pilot group, their experiences with the horses yielding benefits that extended beyond simple horsemanship. Might need to build that covered area sooner than later then, Hank noted, mentally adjusting his winter project timeline. Can't have kids out here in the snow. Dad, Emma said after a moment's silence, are you sure you're okay with all this? It's a big change from how things used to be around here. Hank considered the question, watching as Chance playfully nudged Hope, initiating one of their impromptu races across the pasture. The Triple D had indeed changed, not just physically, with the new paddock areas in the classroom space they were planning to build near the barn, but in its fundamental purpose. What had been a traditional cattle operation for 3 generations was evolving into something different, still a working ranch, but now also a place of education, rehabilitation, and second chances. Your mother would have loved this, he said finally. Remember how she was always bringing home strays? Said every creature deserved someone who saw its value. Emma smiled, the memory of her mother momentarily brightening her eyes. She'd have had those foals sleeping in the house if you'd let her. Probably would have, Hank agreed with a chuckle. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. Martha and John Jenkins' pickup appeared on the access road, followed by Sarah's truck. Sunday visits had become a tradition over the past months, the Jenkins coming to spend time with the yearlings that represented their life's work, Sarah stopping by more as friend than veterinarian now that the horses were fully recovered. Looks like we've got company, Emma observed. Family, Hank corrected quietly. Because that's what they had become, not by blood, but through shared purpose and mutual support through difficult times. The foals had drawn them together, creating connections that now extended beyond the original crisis. As the visitors parked and approached, Hank whistled softly. Hope and Chance immediately lifted their heads, then trotted over to the fence line, recognizing the signal that meant attention and treats were forthcoming. John Jenkins moved with greater confidence now, using only a cane rather than the walker he had needed months ago. His speech remained halting, but had improved dramatically, allowing him to express the thoughts that had been trapped inside during his early recovery. Good morning, he greeted, his eyes brightening as Hope approached to gently nuzzle his outstretched hand. They knew you were coming, Hank said, opening the gate to let the visitors enter the paddock. Always do somehow. Animals sense more than we give them credit for, Martha observed, watching her husband as he carefully stroked Hope's neck, his weathered rancher's hand gentle against her golden coat. Sarah approached with her informal assessment, more habit than necessity now. They're looking spectacular, she announced after giving both yearlings a quick once-over. You'd never know what they went through. Oh, I think they remember, Hank said thoughtfully. They're just not defined by it anymore. As the morning progressed, Hank found himself standing slightly apart, watching the interactions unfold. John communing quietly with Hope, Martha, and Emma, discussing plans for the educational program, Sarah sharing professional observations on the yearling's development. In that moment of reflection, he thought back to that morning 4 months ago when he'd first spotted 2 desperate foals by his fence line. How close they had come to being simply another casualty of corporate indifference, anonymous losses in the pursuit of profit margins. How different his own life would have been if he'd chosen the easier path of calling animal control and continuing his daily rounds. Some choices, he realized, weren't really choices at all, not when you understood who you were and what truly mattered. Saving those foals hadn't been heroic. It had been necessary, as natural as breathing. Hope approached, breaking his reverie, her gentle eyes meeting his with the trust that still humbled him every time he witnessed it. Chance wasn't far behind, playfully demanding his share of attention. Hank knelt down, his weathered hands stroking their necks as they pressed close on either side of him. In the distance, the mountains stood sentinel against the clear autumn sky, a backdrop to a moment of perfect connection between a man and two young horses who had found in each other exactly what they needed: a second chance, a new purpose, and the healing power of unconditional care. Some wounds, Hank reflected, never fully disappeared, but with enough time and patience, they could become simply part of a larger story, not of loss and abandonment, but of resilience and hope.